What if everything you thought you knew about Passover was only half the story? Millions celebrate it every year. The candles, the meal, the ancient prayers, but almost no one sees what's hidden underneath. Tonight, one young man's search for answers would shake the foundation of everything he believed. Ethan Carter was 26 years old the night his whole understanding of Scripture collapsed on a kitchen table in Charleston, South Carolina. It was past midnight. His Bible was open. His coffee had gone cold hours ago. And he was staring at a passage he had read 100 times before, yet somehow, for the first time in his life, he felt like he was seeing it for the very first time. He read it again, slowly. "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." He set down his pen. Something was wrong, or rather, something was right. More right than anything he had ever encountered, and he could not explain why those words were making his hands shake. Ethan had grown up in a good Christian home. Sunday services, Bible camps, youth groups. He had heard the story of Passover before Moses' Egypt, the plagues, the Exodus. It was one of those foundational Sunday school stories that people learn young and then somewhere along the way file away in the back of the mind under the category of history. Ancient history. Someone else's story. Something that happened a very long time ago to a very different group of people. But what he was reading now did not feel ancient. It felt urgent. He grabbed his notebook and wrote 3 words at the top of the page. Who was this for? Yoink. The next morning, Ethan called his pastor a quiet man named Gerald Hughes, who had spent 40 years in ministry and had the kind of voice that made you feel like everything was going to be okay even when it wasn't. "Pastor Gerald," Ethan said without even saying hello, "can I ask you something about Passover?" There was a pause on the other end. "Ethan, it's 6:15 in the morning." "I know. I'm sorry, but I need to understand something." Another pause. Then Gerald sighed, the kind of sigh that wasn't irritated, just tired. "Go ahead." "When we talk about Passover in church, we talk about it like it's a Jewish holiday, like it belongs to another tradition, another people. But last night I was reading Exodus and I kept feeling like we're missing something, like there's a layer underneath the story that nobody talks about. Does that make sense?" The silence that followed was longer than Ethan expected. "Yes," Gerald finally said. "It makes more sense than most people are comfortable with." That one sentence hit Ethan like cold water. He stood up from his chair. "What do you mean?" "Come to my office this afternoon," Gerald said. "Bring your Bible, and bring that notebook I know you always carry around." Ethan arrived at the church at 2 o'clock. Gerald was already there, sitting at his desk, surrounded by open books, not just Bibles, but commentaries, historical texts, pages marked with yellow sticky notes. It was clear that Gerald had not gone back to sleep after their phone call. He had been reading. That alone told Ethan everything. "Sit down," Gerald said. Ethan sat. Gerald folded his hands on the desk and looked at him with an expression that was not quite excitement and not quite gravity, but something in between. "Let me ask you something first," Gerald said. "When you read the Passover story, what do you see?" Ethan thought about it. "I see a rescue, God rescuing Israel from slavery in Egypt." "Good. What else?" "A lamb, The blood, the door, the angel passing over the houses that were marked. Good. Gerald nodded slowly. Now tell me, do you think God designed that story for one moment in history, or do you think it was designed to mean something bigger? Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, then said quietly, I think it was designed to mean something bigger, but I don't know how to prove it. Gerald stood up and walked to the window. That's the question that changed my life 40 years ago, he said. And most people, most Christians, even never ask it. They hear Passover, and they think Jewish holiday. They think Egypt a long time ago, somebody else's story, and they move on. He turned around. But what if Passover wasn't a Jewish holiday? Ethan stared at him. What do you mean? What if it was a preview? What doing? The word hung in the air between them. A preview. Ethan felt something shift inside his chest, the way a key shifts in a lock just before it opens. A preview of what? He asked, though some part of him already knew the answer. Gerald walked back to his desk and picked up a thick commentary. He turned to a page he had marked not with a sticky note, but with a torn piece of paper that looked like it had been there for decades. Ethan, every element of Passover the lamb, the blood, the timing, the meal, the unleavened bread, every single element is not accidental. It is not tradition for the sake of tradition. It is a blueprint, and that blueprint was not completed in Egypt. Gerald put the book down and looked at him directly. It was completed 700 miles away, in a city called Jerusalem, on a hill called Golgotha, about 1,400 years later. The room was very quiet. Ethan heard his own heartbeat. Jesus, he said. Jesus, Gerald confirmed. But here's the part that no one tells you in Sunday school, Ethan. Here's the part that will keep you awake at night. He paused. The night Jesus was crucified, what was happening in the city of Jerusalem? Ethan's mind raced. He knew this. He had read it a dozen times. But now, with Gerald standing in front of him, asking the question out loud, the answer felt like something he was hearing for the very first time. Passover, Ethan said slowly. The Passover lambs were being sacrificed. Gerald nodded. At the exact same hour, he said. At the exact same time that thousands of Passover lambs were being killed in the temple courts, Jesus of Nazareth was being crucified on a cross outside the city walls. He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Tell me that is a coincidence. I dare you. Gee. Ethan could not speak. He looked down at his notebook, at the 3 words he had written the night before. Who was this for? And suddenly the answer did not feel like a theological statement. It felt like something personal, something written specifically for him. For anyone who had ever felt trapped, for anyone who had ever wondered if there was a way out of the darkness they were living in. I thought about his father, a man who had spent the last 5 years of his life drowning in guilt over choices he could not undo. A man who sat in the back pew of a church every Sunday, but never felt like the message was meant for him. He thought about his college roommate, David, brilliant, angry, deeply skeptical of anything religious, who had once said to him, "If there is a God, why does it feel like the door is always locked from the inside?" He thought about the elderly woman from his neighborhood, Mrs. Patterson, who prayed every morning but told Ethan once with tears in her eyes that she was not sure God heard her anymore, that she felt like she was on the wrong side of the door. The wrong side of the door, the blood on the doorpost. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. Pastor Gerald, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. This message, the real message of Passover, why don't people know this? Gerald sat back down. His expression was not triumphant. It was not proud. It was something much closer to grief. Because we've made it complicated, he said quietly. We've turned it into theology, into denomination, into debate. And somewhere in all of that, we lost the story. And when you lose the story, you lose the people. He looked at Ethan. That young man your age, who doesn't come to church because he thinks God is irrelevant. He doesn't need an argument. He needs a story. He needs to know that the rescue story didn't start 2,000 years ago with Jesus. It started thousands of years before that in Egypt on the night when a terrified family smeared lamb's blood on a wooden door frame and trusted that God's promise was enough. Ethan stared at him. That story is his story, Gerald said. It's your father's story. It's Mrs. Patterson's story. It's everyone's story. But nobody is telling it that way. Ethan drove home that evening with the windows down. He was not thinking about theology. He was thinking about a door. He was thinking about the fact that the most important act of faith recorded in the entire Old Testament was not a sermon. It was not a conference. It was not a religious argument. It was a family standing inside a house, trusting that the blood on the door was enough, that they did not have to earn it, that they did not have to be perfect to qualify, that they simply had to be inside. He pulled into his driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark for a long moment. Then he picked up his notebook, crossed out the original question, and wrote something new. This story was never just for them. It was always for us. He looked at those words for a very long time, and for the first time in his life, Ethan Carter felt like he understood what the word gospel actually meant. Not a religion, not a system, not a set of rules to follow. A rescue that had been planned, written, rehearsed, and announced thousands of years before any of them were born. And it all began with a lamb, 3 days after his conversation with Pastor Gerald. Ethan did something that surprised even himself. He booked a flight to Philadelphia, not because he had family there, not because of work, but because one name kept appearing in every book he opened, every commentary he read, every footnote he chased down at 2 a.m. with cold coffee and a racing mind. That name was Dr. Raymond Holt, a retired professor of ancient Near Eastern history who had spent 30 years teaching at the University of Pennsylvania before writing a book that almost nobody outside of academic circles had ever read. The book was called The Architecture of Sacrifice, and it had been sitting in a used bookstore in downtown Charleston for $6. Ethan had read it in one night. By the time he landed in Philadelphia, he had read it twice. He found Dr. Holt exactly where a mutual contact had told him he would be, at a small diner 2 blocks from campus, drinking black coffee, reading a newspaper, looking like a man who had absolutely nowhere else to be. Ethan slid into the booth across from him without waiting to be invited. Holt looked up over his reading glasses. He was in his late 70s with white hair and sharp eyes that took in everything at once. He did not look surprised to see a stranger sitting across from him. He looked like a man who had been expecting this conversation for a long time and was mildly annoyed it had taken this long to arrive. "You're the one who called about the Passover lamb," Holt said flatly. "Yes, sir." "You're not a scholar." "No, sir." "What are you?" Ethan thought about it honestly. Someone who can't stop asking a question. Holt studied him for a moment. Then he folded his newspaper, set it aside, and picked up his coffee. "Fine," he said. "Ask your question." Ethan leaned forward. "In your book, you write that the Passover sacrifice was not just a ritual. You say it was a pattern, a template that repeated itself throughout the entire Hebrew Bible. I need to know if you actually believe that, or if it was just a thesis." Holt set down his coffee very slowly. "Young man," he said, "I spent 30 years of my career trying to convince academic colleagues that what you just described was provable through historical and textual analysis alone, without any theological claim whatsoever." He paused. "Most of them thought I was either brilliant or completely unhinged. Which were you?" For the first time, Holt smiled. It was a small smile, like a door opening just a crack. "Both," he said. "Sit down properly. You look like you're about to fall out of your seat." Ethan straightened. "Tell me about the pattern." Holt picked up his coffee again and looked at it for a moment before speaking. "Every major turning point in the Hebrew Bible involves the same elements," he said quietly. "Substitute, blood, covering, rescue. Those 4 elements appear so consistently in so many different contexts across so many different centuries that it is statistically impossible for them to be accidental." He looked up. "Do you understand what I mean by statistically impossible?" "You mean someone designed it?" "I mean someone designed it," Holt said. "Whether you call that someone God or something else is your theological business. My business is the text, and the text tells me that what happened in Egypt on Passover night was not the beginning of a tradition. It was the announcement of a plan." The diner was noisy around them, plates clattering, conversations overlapping, but Ethan heard none of it. "Walk me through it," he said. Holt leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way a man does when he is organizing decades of thought into something digestible. Then he looked back at Ethan and started talking. "Before Passover," Holt said, "there is Abraham. Do you know the story of Abraham and Isaac? His son. God asked him to sacrifice Isaac, then stopped him at the last moment and provided a ram." "Correct. Now think about what God said in that moment." Holt's voice dropped slightly. "God said, 'On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided.' Future tense, not present. He didn't say, 'Here is a ram.' He said, 'This is a preview of something that will be provided on this mountain in the future.'" He paused. "Do you know what mountain that was?" Ethan's mouth went dry. "Mount Moriah." "Mount Moriah," Holt repeated, "which is the same mountain range on which Jerusalem was built, on which the temple was built, on which approximately 2,000 years after Abraham lifted that knife, a man named Jesus of Nazareth was executed. He let that land. The same mountain, the same sacrifice, the same 4 elements: substitute, blood, covering, rescue." Ethan pressed his hands flat on the table to keep them from shaking. "That can't be a coincidence," he said. "I have spent 30 years verifying that it isn't," Holt said, and his voice was completely calm. And the further back you go, the more you see that the Passover story in Egypt wasn't even the first time this pattern appeared. It was just the loudest. He reached into the bag beside him and pulled out a worn, annotated copy of his own book. He opened it to a page that was covered in handwritten notes in the margins, additions, and corrections he had made years after publication. "Here," he said, turning it toward Ethan. "You see this line I wrote in this book that the Passover pattern had 5 documented instances in the Hebrew Scriptures. That was wrong. I've since found 11. He pointed to the margin. 11 separate moments in the Old Testament where the same blueprint appears, substitute blood covering rescue, each one escalating in scale, each one pointing forward to something larger. He looked at Ethan. It is the most consistent structural pattern in ancient literature. Nothing else in human writing comes close. Why don't people know this? Ethan asked, and his voice came out more raw than he intended. Why isn't this the conversation everyone is having? Holt closed the book. He looked at Ethan with an expression that was neither cynical nor hopeful, just honest. Because it requires people to sit with discomfort, he said. If the pattern is real, and I believe it is, then Passover is not just a Jewish memory, and it's not just a Christian theology. It is a message that does not belong to any single tradition. It belongs to anyone who has ever been trapped and needed a way out. He paused. That is not a comfortable thing to say out loud. It collapses a lot of walls that people have spent a long time building. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Ethan asked the question that had been sitting at the back of his throat since the night he opened his Bible in Charleston. Dr. Holt, do you believe it not academically, personally? The older man looked at him for a long time without speaking. Outside, a car horn sounded. Someone laughed loudly 2 tables away. The world kept going. I believe, Holt finally said, that no human being is capable of constructing that level of literary and historical architecture across 1,400 years of writing by dozens of different authors in multiple languages and cultural contexts without something larger than human intelligence guiding it. He picked up his coffee. What you do with that belief is between you and whatever you think is on the other side of the door. The other side of the door. Ethan felt the phrase land in his chest like a stone dropping into still water. He thought about his father again. His father who sat in the back pew every Sunday and never moved forward, who never felt like the door was open for him. His father believed that grace had a list, that there were qualifications, that he had failed too many times and in too many ways to be included. And Ethan realized sitting in that diner in Philadelphia that his father had the same misunderstanding that millions of people carried about Passover itself. His father thought salvation was a reward, but Passover was never about reward. The families in Egypt who painted blood on their doorposts were not the best families in Egypt. They were not the holiest. They were not the most educated or the most morally upright. They were simply the families who trusted the promise and acted on it. That was the only qualification. Trust and act. He pulled out his notebook, the same one he had been carrying since Charleston, and wrote that down before he lost it. The qualification was not perfection, it was trust. He stared at those words, then added, "That is the thing nobody is saying out loud." Holt watched him write without comment. When Ethan looked up, the older man was studying him with something that looked almost like recognition. "You're going to do something with this, aren't you?" Holt said. It was not really a question. "I don't know yet," Ethan said honestly. "Yes, you do," Holt said. He reached out and tapped the notebook with one finger. "You already know exactly what you're going to do. You just haven't admitted it to yourself." Ethan looked down at the notebook, at the question he had written in Charleston. Who was this for? At the answer he had written the night after talking to Gerald. This story was never just for them. It was always for us. And now, in a diner in Philadelphia, a new line forming beneath all the others. The qualification was not perfection. It was trust. 3 sentences, 3 nights, 3 different cities in his mind, if not on the map. And each one felt less like a discovery he was making, and more like a message he was receiving. He closed the notebook. "One more question," he said to Holt. "Go ahead. You said the pattern escalates 11 instances, each one pointing forward to something larger. What is the largest? What is the final fulfillment of the pattern?" Holt looked at him steadily. "You already know the answer to that question," he said quietly. "That's why you're here." Ethan held his gaze. He did know. He had known since the night in Charleston, since the moment his hands started shaking over a single verse. "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." He just needed to hear someone else say it out loud. He needed to know he wasn't inventing it. He needed to know the story was real. And sitting across from a 78-year-old historian in a noisy Philadelphia diner, Ethan Carter understood for the first time that the most important journeys a person takes are never really about the destination. They are about what gets unlocked inside you along the way. Something had been unlocked, and there was no closing it again. Ethan did not go home after Philadelphia. He drove. He did not have a destination. He just needed the road, the motion, the feeling of moving forward while everything inside him was still catching up. I had 3 notebooks filled by now. Pages covered in verses, questions, cross-references, names, dates, connections. Things that should not connect, but did. Things that had no business lining up across 14 centuries of history, and yet they lined up anyway with a precision that made his chest tight every time he looked at them. He pulled over at a rest stop somewhere in New Jersey and called his friend Marcus Webb, a man he had known since college, a former skeptic who had found faith in his 30s after his daughter nearly died in a hospital, and he had spent 3 nights praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Marcus was now a pastor in Baltimore. More importantly, Marcus was the kind of man who did not soften things. He told you what he saw exactly as he saw it, and let you decide what to do with it. Ethan needed that right now more than he needed comfort. Marcus picked up on the second ring. "You sound like you haven't slept," Marcus said instead of hello. "I haven't." "Where are you?" "New Jersey, a rest stop. I just left a historian's diner in Philadelphia, and I think I need to talk to someone who won't let me make this smaller than it is." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Make what smaller?" "The connection," Ethan said. "Between Passover and the cross. Marcus, it's not a metaphor. It's not a theological concept someone invented later to make Christianity sound more Jewish. It is a structural, historical, textual reality that was built into the story from the beginning." He stopped, took a breath. "And I don't think most people who sit in church on Easter Sunday have any idea." Another silence, longer this time. "Pull back onto the road," Marcus said finally. "Drive to Baltimore. Come to my church. There's someone here you need to meet." "Who?" "A woman named Ruth Abrams. She's 81 years old. She's Jewish. She's been attending our church for 2 years, and she has never converted, and she has never explained why she keeps coming back." He paused. "But I think you might be the reason." Ethan stared through the windshield. "Marcus." "Just come," Marcus said, and hung up. Ethan pulled back onto the road. He arrived in Baltimore 3 hours later. Marcus met him at the door of the church, a converted building in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing grand, the kind of place that looked like it had absorbed decades of real human grief and real human joy into its walls. Marcus himself was a big man with a gentle handshake and eyes that noticed everything. He looked at Ethan the way a doctor looks at a patient, assessing, not judging. "You look terrible," Marcus said warmly. "I feel alive," Ethan said, which is almost the same thing. Marcus smiled and led him inside. Ruth Abrams was already there, seated in a pew near the front, small and unhurried, with white hair and hands folded in her lap like someone who had learned long ago that patience was not weakness, it was armor. She looked up when Ethan walked in, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, more like recognition. Marcus introduced them. They shook hands. And then Marcus stepped back and let the conversation go where it needed to go. Ruth spoke first. "Marcus tells me you've been studying Passover," she said. Her voice was steady, clear, completely unafraid. "Yes, ma'am." "What have you found?" Ethan sat down. He looked at his hands for a moment, then looked at her. "I've found that most Christians celebrate the cross without understanding where the cross came from. And I've found that most people, Jewish or Christian, celebrate Passover without understanding where it was going." Ruth studied him. "Go on." "The lamb," Ethan said. "In Egypt, the Passover lamb had to be selected on the 10th day of the month. It had to be kept for 4 days, examined for any defect, confirmed to be perfect. Then it was killed on the 14th day, at twilight." He leaned forward slightly. "In the Gospel of John, Jesus enters Jerusalem on the 10th of Nisan. The same day the Passover lambs were being selected. He spends 4 days in the temple courts being questioned, tested, examined by Pharisees, by Sadducees, by lawyers, by Roman authority. Every group trying to find a defect. Every group failing." His voice dropped. "And then on the 14th of Nisan, at the same hour the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple, Jesus is crucified." The church was absolutely silent. Ruth did not move. Ethan kept going. "The lamb in Egypt had to have no broken bones. In Exodus, it says specifically, do not break any of its bones. In John chapter 19, after the crucifixion, the Roman soldiers break the legs of the 2 men crucified beside Jesus to speed their death. Standard procedure. When they get to Jesus, he is already dead, so they don't break his legs." He paused. John notes this specifically, and then he quotes Exodus, word for word. "Not one of his bones will be broken." Ruth's jaw tightened. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, then opened them. "I know those passages," she said quietly. "I know you do," Ethan said. "What I want to ask you, and I'm asking because Marcus thinks you've been sitting with a question of your own, is why you think John made that connection. Was he inventing a parallel to convince Jewish readers? Or was he recording something that actually happened exactly as it happened, because the story was always designed to end that way? Ruth was quiet for a long time. Outside, a car passed. A door opened somewhere down the hall. Marcus sat perfectly still. Then Ruth said something that Ethan did not expect. "My grandmother survived the Holocaust," she said. "She came to America in 1947 with nothing, no family, no language, no money. She lived with strangers for 2 years before she found her footing." She paused. "Every Passover she would hold the Seder, and she would tell us that Passover was not about Egypt. She would say, 'Egypt is the name we gave it.' But the story is about every darkness, every bondage, every moment when a people cries out and wonders if God has forgotten them." Ruth looked at Ethan directly. She believed that with everything in her. After everything she had seen, she still believed that God had not forgotten. Ethan felt something move in his throat. "She sounds like a woman of tremendous faith," he said. "She was," Ruth said. "She died when I was 40, and when she died I stopped celebrating Passover." A beat. Because without her the story felt empty, like a beautiful frame with no picture inside it. Ethan held very still. "And then," Ruth continued, "about 5 years ago, I was given a copy of the New Testament by a neighbor. I read it only because I was bored, and the neighbor was persistent." The corner of her mouth moved almost a smile. "I got to the Gospel of John, and I read the account of the Last Supper, and I read the account of the crucifixion, and I sat with my Bible closed on my lap for a very long time." She paused. "Because what I had just read felt like the inside of the picture my grandmother had been holding the frame for her entire life." The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. Marcus behind them exhaled slowly. Ethan's eyes were burning. "She knew," he said. It wasn't a question. "She didn't know the name," Ruth said, "but she knew the shape of the story. She knew that Passover pointed somewhere. She just never knew where." Ruth's voice remained steady, but something in it had changed thinner, now more honest. "And I have spent 5 years sitting in this church, not because I have resolved every theological question I haven't, but because I cannot stop seeing my grandmother's frame and this picture fitting together perfectly." She looked at Ethan. "And I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it right now," Ethan said. "But can I tell you what I believe?" She nodded. "I believe your grandmother understood the deepest truth of Passover better than most theologians I've ever read. She understood that the story is not about a single nation or a single night. It is about what God does every time darkness presses in and human strength runs out. He provides, he covers, he rescues." Ethan's voice steadied. "And I believe that when John the Baptist stood at the Jordan River and pointed at Jesus and said, 'Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world,' he was not inventing a new religion. He was finishing a sentence that God had started in Egypt 1400 years before." Ruth closed her eyes again. This time she did not open them quickly. When she did, there were tears not falling. Just present the way tears sit in the eyes of people who have learned how to hold grief with dignity. "Finishing a sentence," she repeated softly. "My grandmother would have loved that." Ethan nodded. He could not trust his own voice for a moment. Marcus stood up and walked to the front. He sat down in the pew across from them and leaned forward, elbows on knees, looking at both of them with an expression that was irreverent and broken open at the same time. This is why Passover still matters, Marcus said quietly. Not as a Jewish holiday, not as a Christian symbol, as a story that refuses to stay in the past because it is still happening. Every person who has ever felt trapped in guilt, in grief, in addiction, in shame, in the sheer weight of being human, is standing in front of that same door. He looked at Ethan. And the blood is already on the post. Ethan wrote that down in his notebook. He wrote it fast before the moment could pass. The blood is already on the post. Then he looked up at Ruth and asked the question that had been building since she first mentioned her grandmother. "When your grandmother held the Seder," he said, "did she ever say what she was waiting for?" Ruth thought about it. Her eyes went distant for a moment, back across decades, back to a kitchen that no longer existed, back to a woman who no longer lived, but whose words had traveled intact through time to this exact moment in a Baltimore church. "Yes," Ruth said. Every year at the end of the Seder, she would say the same thing. She paused. She would say, "The story is not over yet. God does not leave rescue unfinished." The room held that sentence like cupped hands hold water. Ethan did not write it down. Some things do not need to be written. They just need to be heard and believed and carried forward. Ethan drove back to Charleston the next morning. He had not planned to. He had told himself he would stay in Baltimore another day, talk more with Marcus, maybe sit again with Ruth. But somewhere around 4 in the morning, lying on a cot in the church's back room, staring at the ceiling with his notebook on his chest, he understood that the journey he had been taking outward to Philadelphia, to Baltimore, through other people's offices and diners and sanctuaries, had just turned inward, and that the next conversation he needed to have was not with a historian or a pastor or a Holocaust survivor's granddaughter. It was with his father. He pulled into his parents' driveway just after noon. His mother met him at the door, looked at his face, and said nothing. She simply stepped aside and pointed down the hallway. His father was in the backyard, sitting alone in a plastic chair, doing what he did most afternoons, now that he was retired, holding a cup of coffee and looking at nothing in particular. Ethan had been afraid of this conversation for years. Not because his father was a hard man. He wasn't. James Carter was in many ways the softest person Ethan had ever known, a man who cried at commercials, who rescued stray animals, who had never in Ethan's memory raised his voice in anger. But James Carter carried something invisible and enormous, something that had settled onto his shoulders decades ago and never left. A weight made entirely of his own past decisions. Things he had done wrong, people he had hurt, moments of weakness he could not forgive himself for no matter how many years passed. James went to church every Sunday. He knew every word of every hymn. He could quote scripture from memory, and often did. But he sat in the back. Always the back. And whenever someone tried to talk to him about grace, real grace, the kind that did not require a list of prerequisites, James would nod politely and change the subject. Ethan had never known how to break through that wall, until now. He walked outside and sat down in the chair next to his father. James looked over at him with mild surprise. He hadn't heard the car pull up, and then smiled the quiet smile of a man genuinely glad to see his son. "Didn't know you were coming," James said. I didn't either, Ethan said. Can I talk to you about something? James looked at him more carefully. He had always been able to read Ethan's face the way you read weather small signs that told you what was coming. You've got that look, he said. What look? The look you get when something has grabbed you and won't let go. Ethan almost laughed. Yeah, that's about right. He told his father everything. Not a summary, not the theological outline, everything. He told him about the night in Charleston with the open Bible and the shaking hands, about Gerald's office and the word preview, about Dr. Holt in the diner and the 11 instances of the same pattern across 1,400 years, about Ruth Abrams and her grandmother and the frame with no picture inside it. His father listened without interrupting. That was one of James Carter's gifts. He could listen to a person the way the ground absorbs rain completely, without resistance. When Ethan finished, James was quiet for a long time. His coffee had gone cold. He turned the cup slowly in his hands. Then he said, "The families in Egypt, the ones who put the blood on the door." "Yes," Ethan said. "You said they weren't the best families. They weren't the holiest." "That's right." James nodded slowly. "Were any of them people who had done things they weren't proud of?" Ethan felt the question like a stone dropped into the center of his chest. "The Bible doesn't say they were perfect, Dad. It says they were chosen. And the only thing that protected them that night was not who they were. It was what was on the door." James said nothing. Ethan pressed forward gently, but without retreating. The lamb was killed in their place, not because they deserved it, not because they had earned a rescue, but because God provided one. And all they had to do, the only thing required, was trust it and stay inside. His father's jaw tightened. His eyes stayed fixed on the cup in his hands. "Dad," Ethan said, "you have sat in the back of that church for 30 years believing that grace is for other people, believing that what you've done puts you in a category that God's rescue doesn't reach." He paused. "But that is not what Passover says. That is not what the cross says. That is something you built yourself out of guilt, and you have been living inside it like it is a house you cannot leave." James's hands went still. "The door was never locked from the outside," Ethan said quietly. "It was never God keeping you at a distance. The distance was always your own. The silence between them was long enough to be uncomfortable and honest enough to be necessary." James Carter looked up from his cup. His eyes were wet, not overflowing, just full. The way a man's eyes get when something he has been holding for a very long time is finally being set down. "It can't be that simple," he said. His voice was rough. "After everything, it was simple enough for a family in Egypt with no credentials and no perfect record," Ethan said. "The only thing they brought to the door was themselves." James pressed his lips together. He looked away, looked back. "I don't know how to stop feeling like I owe something," he said. "Like I have to pay it back first." "I know," Ethan said. "But that's the whole point. That's the point nobody is saying out loud. You cannot pay it back. That is not the arrangement. The lamb was killed so you wouldn't have to be. The price was paid so you don't have to spend the rest of your life trying to cover a debt that no longer exists." James exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that carries something out of the body, something that has been compressed in the lungs for years. "Your mother has been telling me this for 30 years, he said, and something almost like a smile crossed his face. "Mom is a wise woman," Ethan said. "She is." James was quiet for another moment. Then, "You really believe all of this, the pattern, the lamb, the connection, you believe it's real? Not just a story people tell to feel better?" Ethan did not hesitate. "I believe it is the most documented, most internally consistent, most structurally coherent story in human history. I believe it was designed, not assembled. And I believe it was designed specifically for people who feel like they are on the wrong side of the door." He met his father's eyes. "For people like you, and like me, and like every person who has ever sat in a back pew wondering if the message was for somebody else." James Carter looked at his son for a long moment. Then he did something Ethan had not seen him do in years. He laughed. Not a loud laugh, a small, broken, releasing kind of laugh. The kind that comes from a person who has just realized that what they were afraid of was never as solid as they thought. 30 years, his father said, shaking his head. 30 years of sitting in the back. "You can move up," Ethan said. "It's not about the seat." "No," Ethan agreed. "It's not about the seat." His father put down the cup, rubbed his face with both hands. When he dropped them, he looked 10 years younger. Not because anything had been resolved in a single conversation. Ethan knew it was not that simple, and his father knew it too. But because something had cracked. Something that had been sealed shut for a very long time had shifted. "Tell me again," his father said. "About the families, about what they did." So Ethan told him again, slowly this time. Not from his notebooks, not from commentary footnotes, from memory and from the gut, the way a story should be told when it matters. He described a family standing in a small home in Egypt. Terror outside, judgment coming. Every credential they had ever earned, every achievement, every status, none of it mattered in that moment. The only thing that stood between them and death was a lamb. The blood of something innocent placed on the wood of the doorframe between them and everything they feared. And God's promise, not a wish, not a hope, but a covenant promise that when he saw the blood, he would pass over them. Not because they deserved it, because he said so. James listened with his eyes closed. Ethan talked until there was nothing left to say. And when the silence came back, it was a different quality of silence than before. Softer, less defended. His father opened his eyes. "The blood is already on the post," James said quietly. Ethan went still. Those were Marcus's words. He had not said them to his father. He had not mentioned Marcus at all. "Where did you hear that?" he asked. His father looked at him with mild confusion. "I didn't hear it anywhere. It just came to me. While you were talking." He paused. "Is that right, theologically?" Ethan's throat tightened. "Yes," he managed. "That's exactly right." He thought about Ruth's grandmother, about a woman who had survived unimaginable darkness and still stood at the end of a Seder table and said, "The story is not over yet. God does not leave rescue unfinished." He thought about Dr. Holt, who spent 30 years proving with academic rigor what Ruth's grandmother had always known, through grief and faith, that the pattern was real, that it was designed, that it was pointing somewhere. He thought about Pastor Gerald saying, "When you lose the story, you lose the people." And he understood now in a way he had not fully grasped before why this story mattered so urgently. Not as theology, not as religious argument, but as oxygen. There were millions of people like his father, sitting in the back, convinced the door was for someone else, carrying debt that had already been canceled, living in darkness that had already been paid for, unable to cross a threshold that had never been locked against them. They did not need a better argument. They needed someone to tell them the story, the real story. Not the sanitized Sunday school version, not the theological outline, the full, unfiltered 1,400-year-long story of a God who was so committed to rescuing people from darkness that he wrote the rescue plan into the very fabric of history itself, encoded it in blood and lamb and doorpost and Passover night, so that when the moment finally arrived, and the Lamb of God was lifted up outside Jerusalem, no one who was paying attention could say they hadn't seen it coming, because it had been announced. In Egypt, by a lamb, by blood on a wooden frame, by a night when death passed over those who trusted the promise. Ethan looked at his father. James was looking at the sky. His face was open in a way Ethan had never quite seen before. Not resolved, not yet, but open. And sometimes Ethan thought open is enough. Open is where everything starts. Part 5. Lưu ý, viết đủ 1.500 liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện. Liên mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liên mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng. Đột ngột không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng, hoặc tiêu đề, phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ-Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh tập trung vào hành động cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Để lại ấn tượng sâu sắc, điều này có thể là một câu hỏi mờ, một lời kêu gọi hành động, hoặc một câu trích dẫn, kinh thánh mạnh mẽ. Viết phần 5 đạt điểm 10. Chi, psi và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh sửa lỗi AI. Kẻ theo ngôi thứ ba giữ đồ kịch tính, không viết lan man. Kết thúc dùng câu khẳng định mạnh để khép lại câu chuyện rõ ràng, trọn vẹn. Lưu ý trả lời trong một tin nhắn, không nhảy sang mực document. You want to feud có một twist luôn sâu sắc, đang xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn. Tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu, kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 1-2 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả canh, không có phần gạch ở phần bài viết và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nhé. Message Collapsed Part 5. The story that was always for you. 6 weeks after sitting in that backyard with his father, Ethan stood in front of 200 people in a community center in Austin, Texas, with nothing but a notebook and everything he had learned. He had not planned to speak publicly. That had never been part of his intention when he opened his Bible in Charleston on that late night with cold coffee and shaking hands. He had been searching for understanding, not for an audience. But Marcus had called him 3 weeks after Baltimore and said a church in Austin had invited him to facilitate a community gathering, not a sermon, not a religious service, just an open conversation about scripture and history, and Marcus thought Ethan should be the one to do it. Ethan had said no, twice. Then Marcus said something that stopped him cold. You told me this story needs to be told for the people sitting in the back. Ethan, those people are in Austin right now, waiting for someone who actually believes it. He booked the flight that afternoon. Now he was standing in front of those 200 people, and the room was so quiet he could hear the air conditioning running. The crowd was mixed older couples, middle-aged men and women, a few younger faces near the back. Some had come from churches. Some had not been inside any religious building in decades. Some wore the careful, arms-crossed expression of people who were present but not yet willing to be moved. Ethan recognized that expression. He had worn it himself. He did not open with a prayer. He did not open with a verse. He opened with a question. "How many of you," he said, "have ever felt like the door was for someone else?" The silence changed quality. It became something more alert, more personal. A woman near the front, mid-60s, silver hair. Hands folded tightly in her lap, looked up at him with an expression that answered the question before anyone spoke. Ethan pressed forward. "I spent the last several months traveling and talking to historians, pastors, scholars, and ordinary people, trying to answer a question that started one night when I couldn't sleep. The question was simple. What is Passover actually about? Not the tradition, not the holiday, not the meal." He paused. What was God trying to say when he designed that night in Egypt? And why does almost no one know the full answer? Someone near the middle of the room shifted in their seat. A man heavy-set somewhere in his 70s, with the look of someone who had spent decades making peace with disappointment, leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Ethan noticed. He always noticed the people who leaned forward. They were the ones who had given up hoping and had not yet fully admitted it to themselves. "The first thing I discovered," Ethan said, "is that Passover was never meant to be a memory. It was meant to be a mirror." He told them about Dr. Holt and the 11 instances of the pattern substitute. Blood-covering rescue threaded through 14 centuries of scripture, with a consistency that no human editorial team could have manufactured. He watched faces change as he talked. The crossed arms loosened. The careful expressions softened into something more unguarded. Then he told them about Ruth Abrams. He told them about a woman who had spent 5 years sitting in a church she had not officially joined, holding a picture that finally fit the frame her grandmother had carried through the Holocaust. He told them what Ruth had said, that her grandmother believed Passover pointed somewhere, that she just never knew where. A woman in the 3rd row pressed her hand over her mouth. Ethan kept going. Ruth's grandmother said something every year at the end of the Seder, he said. She said the story is not over yet. God does not leave rescue unfinished. He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. She said that after surviving the worst darkness of the 20th century, after losing everything, after rebuilding from nothing, his voice did not waver. She still believed that the God who parted the sea and passed over the doorposts had not abandoned the plan. The man in the middle of the room, the heavy-set man who had leaned forward, was very still now. His hands were on his knees. His eyes were focused on something that was not in the room. Ethan recognized that look too. It was the look of a person who was hearing something they had stopped believing they would ever hear. He walked them through the Lamb, the selection on the 10th day, the 4 days of examination, the crucifixion on the 14th of Nisan at the hour of the evening sacrifice. He showed them the connection between the Exodus instruction, "Not one bone shall be broken," and John's eyewitness account at the foot of the cross. He did not rush it. He let each connection arrive at its own weight. And then he said the thing he had been building toward since the first word. "Here is what most people miss," he said. When John the Baptist stood at the Jordan River and pointed at Jesus and said, "Behold the Lamb of God," he was not creating a metaphor. He was not being poetic. He was making a historical identification. Ethan's voice carried now steady and clear. He was saying, "Do you see this man? He is the fulfillment of everything that began in Egypt. He is the Lamb that was always being pointed to. He is the answer to the question that Passover has been asking for 1400 years. A man in the back row stood up. Ethan stopped. The man was perhaps 65, wearing a plain shirt, and he looked like someone who had not planned to speak but could not stop himself. "I've been in church my whole life," the man said. His voice was controlled, but his hands were not. They were pressed flat on the chair back in front of him. "My whole life." And nobody ever explained it that way. Nobody ever connected those two things that directly. He stopped, steadied himself. Why has nobody said this clearly before? The room was absolutely motionless. Ethan looked at him without flinching. Because somewhere along the way we separated two halves of the same story and handed them to different people and told them they didn't belong together. We gave the Old Testament to history and the New Testament to theology, and we stopped letting them do what they were always designed to do, which is to be read as one continuous rescue narrative, start to finish. He held the man's gaze. But the moment you read them together, the moment you let Passover and the cross exist in the same sentence, the story becomes something you cannot explain away. It becomes something that is either the most elaborate accident in human literary history, or it is exactly what it claims to be. The man sat back down slowly. He nodded once. That was all he needed to say. Ethan opened his notebook, the same notebook from Charleston. Pages worn, now edges, soft handwriting, layered over handwriting in the margins. He found the page he was looking for, the very first page. The page with 3 words at the top. Who was this for? He read it aloud to the room. "That was my question," he said. 6 months ago. Sitting alone in Charleston at midnight with a Bible and a question. I didn't know how to answer. He closed the notebook. I have traveled a long way since that night. I have sat across from scholars and survivors and pastors and skeptics. I have filled 3 notebooks. I have had conversations that changed me. He paused. And the answer I have come back with, the answer I believe with everything in me, is this. He let the pause breathe. Passover was for the family in Egypt, who was terrified and had nothing to offer but obedience. It was for the scholar in Philadelphia, who spent 30 years proving something academically that he knew personally all along. It was for a Jewish grandmother who carried a frame through a concentration camp because she believed the picture existed even when she couldn't see it. It was for a man in Charleston who sat in the back pew for 30 years, believing grace had a list he could never make. His voice dropped. And it is for every person in this room who has ever felt like the message was not addressed to them. The silver-haired woman in the front row was crying now. Not dramatically quietly, the way people cry when something true lands after a long time of waiting. The heavy-set man in the middle had both hands covering his face. Ethan did not rush past this moment. He stood in it. The blood on the doorpost in Egypt was not there because the family earned it, he said. It was not there because they were perfect or holy or qualified by any standard we would recognize. It was there because God told them to put it there, and they trusted Him enough to do it. And on the strength of that trust alone, nothing else, death, passed over them. He let that sit. That is the real point of Passover, not the meal, not the tradition, not the historical memory. The real point is that God designed a rescue, planned it, announced it, encoded it into the fabric of history itself for people who could not save themselves, for people who had nothing to offer except their willingness to trust. He looked across the room, row by row, face by face. The lamb was slain, he said. The blood was placed, the door has been marked, and the God who said, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you," is the same God who is saying it still. He closed his notebook for the last time. "The only question that remains," he said quietly, "is whether you are going to spend the rest of your life standing outside, convinced the door is for someone else, or whether you are going to walk through it and discover that your name was written on the other side of it all along." Nobody moved, nobody spoke, and in that silence, the full, weighted, irreversible silence of a room full of people who had just heard something they could not unhear, Ethan Carter understood something that no notebook could have prepared him for. The story was not something he had found. The story had found him in Charleston, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, in his father's backyard, in Austin, Texas, standing in front of 200 people who had arrived carrying the same invisible weight that every human being carries, the fear that they are too far gone, too broken, too late, too unqualified for grace. I thought of Ruth's grandmother one final time, a woman who had looked at the worst the world could do and still stood at the end of a table every year and declared the story is not over. God does not leave rescue unfinished. She was right. The rescue began in Egypt with a lamb and a doorpost and a terrified family who chose to trust. It was completed on a hill outside Jerusalem on the 14th of Nisan at the hour of the evening sacrifice, when the final lamb gave everything so that nothing would ever again stand between a human soul and the God who had been reaching toward it since the beginning. The story is not a tradition to observe. It is a door that has always been open, and it has always from the very first night been open for you.